£5 billion, it sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But let's just try and put it into some sort of context, comparing it with the money that we are already planning to spend this year on COVID-19. So you can see the £5 billion the Prime Minister has been talking about so far, but let's look at the amounts of cash that we're spending already and pledging to spend on COVID-19. You've got £5 billion going towards loan write-offs, add on £56 billion on top of that spent on the furlough scheme. On top of that, you've got £23 billion going on extra welfare payments, another £15 billion going to small businesses, £15 billion on top of that being spent on the NHS and other spending, and another £5 billion on top. You get the idea here. We're talking about an enormous tower of spending, bringing it to about £119 billion of extra spending. Extra spending, that's about equivalent to 6% of GDP. Now, remember that, 6% of GDP. Let's put that into a bit of historical context, and I'll put that 6% over there. So that's extra spending, and what we're going to see here is how that stacks up to a bigger deficit borrowing this year. So 6% extra spending, then you've got 6.5% of GDP. That's the fall in tax receipts, so money that isn't coming into the exchequer. And on top of that, you've got the existing deficit that was already expected this year. Now, tot that all up, and you're talking about 15% of GDP. That is an enormous deficit. And to give you a sense of how enormous, let's compare it to the financial crisis. You know, previously, these were seen as some of the biggest deficits we'd ever had in the UK. But actually, this year will be worse, bigger in terms of deficit than any year in the financial crisis, and bigger too. A lot of talk about FDR, Roosevelt, the New Deal, the 1930s. This is bigger than any single year of Roosevelt's New Deal as well, in terms of a deficit. It's worth saying it's a bit different because a lot of this was investment spending, whereas a lot of this, as we've just seen, is spending on welfare and other things. But it is a lot of money. How is the Prime Minister going to actually pay for it? Well, here's his answer.
What we're saying is that this is the moment to make that big, long-term stake, that backing of Britain, because that will deliver the long-term productivity gains, the gains that will in the end deliver the tax revenues that, of course, we're going to need.
So in short, the answer is productivity. Extra productivity growth that comes from that investment fuels tax revenues. That's the idea. But the problem is, have a look at the history of productivity over the course of the last few years. Look at those white lines. Every government over the past decade has expected productivity to magically rise, bringing in those extra cash to the exchequer. But instead, look, it's flatlined. And the concern is that might well happen this time around. It might be that the Prime Minister is lucky, but it hasn't happened so far. Each year, everyone has been a little bit disappointed.